Good morning. Glad you could be here, and welcome to the talk titled Climate Culprit or Solution, Can the Cow Be the How? And we'll be hearing from three experts who are uniquely qualified to address that question this morning. I'd like to thank Elanco Animal Health and South by Southwest for making this particular session possible, and their goal of getting some clear communication about this topic. I'm excited to be part of this discussion. I've had a sort of 40-year experience in all sorts of agricultural technology things, but mostly from the plant side. And what sort of got me into what eventually became sort of a side career in communication and ended up as a contributor to Forbes is the fact that I would see that there were various aspects of agriculture that weren't really being clearly communicated to the general public. And so I'm always excited when there's a place where that kind of thing is going to be actually addressed. And today's topic is kind of a classic example of that. Climate change matters a lot. I'm sure it matters to you. It matters a lot to me. It matters even more now that I'm a grandpa and projecting what the world's going to be like for them. But one of the things that you're often told if you care about climate change is you should avoid animal products and eat more plant products. And so my career has been mostly on the plant side, but I have a real appreciation for animals, and particularly for ruminants like cattle, because they have what I guess you could call a superpower, which is plants store energy. The most abundant form in which they store energy is called cellulose, and we can't digest that. That's inaccessible to us. But that huge amount of solar stored energy is accessible to us because of ruminants. And they are able to eat all sorts of crops that are very well adapted to lots of areas, can be very important parts of sustainable, regenerative agricultural systems, but they don't make direct human food. And then there's hundreds of millions of acres of naturally occurring grasslands that actually need a grazing animal to actually be as healthy as they can be. So, you know, what animals, and particularly ruminants, do is give us access to all of that and provide us with very important amount of protein for the world. But there's sort of a downside to the ruminant, which is that in the process and the bacteria that are involved in allowing them to digest cellulose, that particular part of their system can generate methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas with kind of unique properties that we'll be hearing more about today, but it is an issue and it needs to be addressed. And that's why I think it's great that we have this discussion this morning, because we have three experts who can explain what that's about and some possible solutions and how to actually make that work in the real world. So to get into the talks today, we'll start with Dr. Frank Mitloehner, and he is a professor and extension agent or extension specialist at the University of California, Davis. And his task there, his role is to work on the research and communication about that research that has to do with the impact of animal agriculture on the environment. And part of that is through something called the Clear Center at Davis, which really facilitates that role. And that's what Frank does, and we'll hand it off to Frank to explain the whole methane situation.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Texas, where I studied for quite some time. And to talk to you about livestock and climate and how we should really think about using the management of livestock to get us to some of the climate goals we have. When you look at all sectors of society globally and how they contribute to a changing climate, all sectors contributing to greenhouse gases, you get to this graph. And it shows that 3/4 of all greenhouse gases are affiliated with the fossil fuel sector, largely producing or using oil, coal, and gas. But as you can see in green, agriculture is also an important contributor to greenhouse gases. The United Nations FAO estimates that globally, livestock contributes to 12% of all greenhouse gases. And the chief gas that livestock emits is methane. And this is really what I will focus on. Methane as the chief greenhouse gas from animal agriculture is not just produced by cows and animal agriculture, but also by other sectors, as this slide shows. On the x-axis, you see different regions of the world, and then methane on the y-axis. And here in blue, you see the contribution that ruminants have, either through enteric emissions, that's the belching or burping of methane from the front end of those animals, as well as their manure. So it is a sizable chunk that we are dealing with. And while methane is just one of the greenhouse gases, as I said, it's the chief one from animal agriculture. And if you look at all the different contributors within the animal agriculture enterprise, the 800-pound gorilla, so to say, are cattle. Okay? They are the ones that produce the most methane, and as indicated in blue here, the main process is enteric fermentation, and that's really what happens in their very large forestomach, the so-called rumen. It has approximately the volume of your bathtub at home, and it has that large volume so that these animals are capable of digesting cellulose, as Steve just said, and produce meat and milk that people want to consume. So cattle are really the main contributor, and as you can see in blue, enteric emissions is really a huge challenge. The consumption of animal source foods is predicted by the United Nations FAO to go up. And that's particularly true for developing countries. In most developed countries of the world, consumption of animal source foods such as meat, milk, eggs is relatively stable. You can see Europe is stable. America has an upward trajectory, but that's not because of North America, but because of Latin America. But overall, we predict, or the FAO predicts, a 70% increase in the demand of animal source foods. So the question really is, how can we meet demand of people, particularly in developing countries, without depleting our natural resources? And how can we reduce the carbon footprint, environmental footprint of livestock while still producing these foods that people want? Some people say, well, what we really need to do is we need to change what we eat. And if you look at data like these ones here from the UK, you see that that has not really happened. Neither in countries like the UK nor elsewhere, we see a marked shift in consumption patterns. You see here on top, these are omnivores, not just meat eaters, but omnivores eating everything, including animal source foods. And then at the bottom, you see flexitarians, vegetarians, vegans, pescatarians, and so on. Overall, what people eat is pretty stable. People might dab into going a year doing something else, but generally they go back to where they originally came from. What I find very interesting is a recent United Nations FAO report, Food and Agriculture of the United Nations, that is, that predicted, first of all, where we are currently with livestock emissions globally, and that's all the way to the left. So this is where we are currently. The second column shows where the livestock sector is growing additional emissions by the year 2050. So the third column here shows what livestock globally will emit with respect to greenhouse gases globally if we do business as usual. So no major mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. On the right side of this graph, you see where the FAO says we need to go by 2050. That is the goal that the FAO has. So the question then is, how do we get from the third column to the last column? From what's predicted as business as usual, all the way to the desirable mitigation outcome. And what you see there is that there are many different steps, the largest of which are productivity increases. You see it there in the sixth column. Then you see breeding, you see things such as improved animal health, and so forth. So each of these little steps is part of a toolbox, as the FAO sees it, and we completely agree. There is no silver bullet. one technology, one approach to reduce emissions. But there's a combination of many approaches, and what works for some farms must not necessarily work for others. What's also interesting on this graph, I think, is that what is often postulated as a silver bullet, which is let's change what we eat, particularly in developed countries, it's depicted in the fourth column here, and that's dietary changes. Contrary to what we often read, the FAO says dietary changes in developed countries are not the most important, but the second least powerful way of reducing our carbon footprint from animal source foods. So that's different from what we normally hear. This report is a very important report. It came out recently. It's called the Pathways Report by the FAO. Now, methane is different from other greenhouse gases. Not just is it 28 times more powerful than CO2, but, and that's where it's different, it's not just produced by various sources, including cattle, but it's also naturally destroyed by a process called oxidation. And that process reduces the lifespan of that gas to a little over a decade. And that's in contrast to 1,000 years for CO2 or over 100 years for nitrous oxide. So what happens when we either increase, and you see that in the top scenario, or hold stable in the center scenario, or strongly reduce methane? What happens in these three scenarios with our climate? If we increase methane, and that happens in part of the developing world, if we increase methane, then you see a lot of blue north of the x-axis, and that is additional warming. That's a scenario we do not want to see. Increasing methane means increasing warming. If we hold methane relatively stable or slightly reduce it, then the amount of methane added to the atmosphere and the amount of methane naturally destroyed is roughly in balance. A constant or near constant methane source will not lead to additional warming as the second to the right scenario shows. But if we strongly reduce methane, and that's the bottom scenario, then we pull a lot of warming from the atmosphere. That's called negative warming. The authors of this paper here called it cooling. So if we strongly reduce methane, we reduce warming. The same is not true for CO2, the same is not true for nitrous oxide, but it is true for methane. And because methane is the chief greenhouse gas from animal agriculture, we in animal agriculture have an important lever over the impact of human activity on climate. There are many different approaches to reduce methane. This is just one. It shows various technologies, feed additives on the left, and then their potency of reducing methane is listed here. So I think within the next 5 years, we'll be at a spot here in the United States where our farmers can use such technologies. In addition to technologies around animal manure, in addition to breeding, in addition to other approaches. In the interest of time, I want to sum this up here. Overall consumption patterns are not markedly changing. Neither are they changing here in developed countries. They are changing in parts of the developing world where emissions increase. But they don't have to because if we become more efficient in how you produce livestock, then you can produce more without emitting more. To reduce emissions, a toolbox of solutions is possible, it's available. And when we reduce emissions, we can reduce warming. And that is something that I find very important to note. It's something that involves working with our farmers and not against them, because if we do so, we can make them part of a climate solution. And with that, I yield my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Well, now you've certainly heard about the situation we're in, and now sort of step into some of the aspects of that toolbox. And to talk about that, we have Jeff Simmons, who is the president and CEO of Dow Elanco Health, Animal Health. And he's Dow Elanco Animal Health, not Dow Elanco, Elanco Animal Health, sorry, is a major player in the health of livestock animals, but also of pets and also of aquaculture. And so very involved in all of those sorts of things. It's also the first sort of independent company to align its goals with the UN sustainability goals, and particularly those to do with climate change. And so Jeff will be able to address some of what's going on from his side of the world on this challenge. So thank you,
Thanks,
Jeff.
Steve. Thank you. Hey, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I heard this morning that South by Southwest, and I've always looked at Austin and looked at this 10 days every year as, an opportunity to transform. And some of the greatest innovations, some of the greatest conversations have come from this conference. Unexpected discovery is what I hear, that comes out of here. And we saw in the video coming up here many things like AI and music, and it's society meets personal things. And I think what we're talking about today is very personal. When you talk about food, when you talk about environment, and when you talk about even, farming, these are really personal things. So I'm not going to bring maybe a science approach, especially following someone that's an expert like Frank, but more of one just more on a personal level. If we're on the streets of Austin talking about this, I'd like to just kind of bring this into kind of perspective. We are 70 years as a company, and our vision is very clear. Making animals' lives better makes life better. Whether that's pets and companionship and dealing with anxiety or food, relative to nutrition and obesity and now environmental health, we like to step into these areas of unexpected discovery to say, hey, we've had 7 decades of this. We see the greatest next door in making animals' life better and life better is environmental health, and how the rumen of a cow can play a solution. And I start with this, just being a little controversial, is everybody has the right to an opinion. And whether you've got a big platform or a small platform, and to say, hey, there is this belief that, hey, you can actually, the just removal of livestock was actually something the United Nations even said a couple years ago. Is that the solution? And, my challenge is everybody can push, and I don't think, as Frank said, this is not a simple, easy answer. It's going to take a toolbox. It's going to take multiple approaches, and we believe that. And, maybe there are some that believe that just removal is the right way. It's our job in animals to lean in. You're going to hear even later in panels from dairy farmers to say, hey, what can we do? So there's a little bit of a personal responsibility. And so here's, Frank shared this. Here's just another looking at the data. The United Nations has said very clearly that we're going to see 50% more growth in the next decade. Listen, we consume more animal protein, meat, milk, eggs, and fish the last 2 years than any time in the history of man. So I'll challenge some of the people on the just removal to say, I think putting a lot of energy to changing the global diet is the wrong thing. Putting energy to finding a solution, an unexpected discovery on what can happen inside a cow and with methane, I think there's breakthroughs. And that's the essence of what we're trying to talk about today in South by Southwest, is we're not going to change this. And I also think really simple, I like to boil things down in a real simple manner, and it's really these 3 numbers: 30, 50, 60. By 2030, we got to move the temperature. And the only way to move the temperature, to boil down what was already been said, is it's with methane, it's not with carbon. Carbon's a long-lasting gas. Methane is more potent, it's shorter term, it's all about methane. If we're going to move the temperature by 2030, it's going to be methane. So hey, cattle industry, let's come to the front of the room, let's be relevant, because we are relevant, let's be responsible, and let's see what we can do. And as an innovator in cattle, we have to see this as one of the greatest areas of discovery. I was in London last week, 140 innovators in animals. I would say at least a third of them are focused on methane, enteric methane reduction. So that's a good thing, where we're chasing innovation. 2 is this 50% number. Let's not run away from this. You can't disconnect, as I say, climate, calories, and choice. And so look, choice is people like animal protein. There's a third of the world that are raising their hands saying, if I can get my GNP up enough, if I can get my personal income up enough, I want to move from plants to animal protein. Taste, cost, nutrition, animal protein usually wins. And, there's this phenomenon nobody predicted 10 years ago called the Western diet. If I ask for a raise of hands of how many people here have been on some type of a keto, Whole30, whatever, you're part of that. Carbs and sugar are coming down. Protein's going up. And when you look at protein, you can't avoid animal protein. And the animal industry is doing a great job of finding better cuts, more sustainable cut, better products than ever before. across the industry. So personal choice. And then lastly is just, look, we still have 60% of the global population that's not getting the right nutrition, whether that's not enough calories or it's getting the wrong calories. I'm sorry, but this movement to GLPs and these products that are actually going to be interventions, okay, that may be a play, but we hold the keys, I believe, American agriculture and global agriculture, to say more protein and better nutrition is ultimately the only way. We have a healthcare system that's not sustainable if we don't get nutrition right. So please, anyone that argues, it's multidimensional. It is climate, it is calories, and it is choice. And these three numbers, I think, are the key things. You cannot disconnect these three. I think that's key. So every consumer research study I've seen, I've lived in Europe, I've lived in Brazil, we've seen it from all angles, whether it's people that support agriculture, don't support, almost everything you see, taste, cost, nutrition. And all of us probably can say, if I go to the grocery store and look, it's mostly taste, cost. It's got to taste good. It's got to be nutritional. And, it's got to be affordable. And these things are factors that drive every research study. But there's another one that I challenge, and we were at the National Cattle Show this year, and it's, hey, we got to look around the corner because choice does matter. And I'm going to point to one segment. And I had a long conversation with one of the leading dairy producers in America this morning. And it was this, is everyone's got their eyes on the Gen Z and even Alpha, the under 30. That's why we need to be at places like this saying they do care. And they do say, I'm a father of 6 kids in this generation. And they're saying, hey, it's not what I'm just eating on what it does to my body. It's what's it doing to the land. And look at these statistics. 66% of current food system, this is the belief, is destroying the planet. 52% believe that they're willing to sacrifice taste. They will sacrifice taste if I can feel better about what it does. And this, to me, is an issue specifically to the cattle industry. And I would say, knowing the cattle industry, they are watching this. And so we've got to lean in on this environmental piece. We've got to be part of the solution. The cow does need to be part of the how, or the next generation is not going to be coming with us. And I think you got to also kind of always say this, as a leader in farm animal innovation, when I walk into laboratories, we always say, hey, it's what do consumers want? They don't want antibiotics in animals, they want alternatives. What do animals need? We can't disconnect that. And hey, how now this third dimension is new. This is this innovation conference I was at. How can we do it and use less environment? That's ultimately where we're going. So that's the goal going after this 2030. So I come back and say, and I think Frank said it so much more with detail and more articulate than I can, to say it does all come back to methane. It's about methane. If we're going to impact temperature in this time period, we got to do this. We got to do it with methane. If we are going to change, whether it's climate warming or climate change, as Steve said, I think that's important. Giving consumers what they need because they do want animal protein, it's got to come back to probably cattle and methane. And we got to figure out a way to do this with economic value. This can't be built on subsidies, built on stories. Sustainability starts with farmer profitability. That's real. So I say it starts and ends with methane. And look, 2 years ago, the United Nations says just removal of livestock, COP26. COP28, this is what came out of this year's big environmental meeting, which was this, is hey, we can reduce methane 25%, we can improve productivity by 1.7%. You can't disconnect them, and you can see the interventions that are here from a lot of the things that were just said by the previous speaker. Ultimately, how do you impact, how do you move towards a climate neutral farming operation, looking specifically at dairy? It's on the land, it's in the animal, it's what comes out of the animal, and it's what's in the value chain. It's the transportation of that protein. And I want to highlight where our energy is as a company, and that's in the animal. That is enteric methane. If you look at the footprint, that's 47%. Is actually from the burping aspect, not the back end of the cow, but the front end of the cow matters a lot, and what happens in the rumen of that cow. We'll talk about that in the discussion. That's where our energy is. You hear a lot about it talk about on the land and the manure, but in the animal is a big opportunity. So I end with this. I end with this picture, and I have all kinds of different pictures of global farms I go to all the time and say, I believe in my lifetime, and I believe definitely for my kids' lifetime, climate neutral farming. Capturing as much emissions as actually created is a vision that I know American agriculture has, global cattle industry has, is this vision's possible. And visions and unexpected discovery is what creates innovation, and that's what we're about today, and this conference is about, and hopefully the discussion is as well.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And our next speaker is Kendra Tolley, and she's the Chief Product Officer of a relatively young company called Athian. Sorry, I don't know why I can't get that right. Athian, and her background really is in the financial sector, but she'll be talking about a critical role that this company is going to play in how do you make this work, these solutions work economically for the cattle producer. And she'll be introducing a concept that's new to a lot of us, which is a carbon inset market, and talking about how that is different from the carbon offset market that you may have heard a lot about. And just something that the goal of her company is both to communicate the whole issue and the economic ramifications of this to the producer community, and then to help them find the ways to actually really make that work within their business. So, turn it over to you.
Thank you. So the first thing I want to just do is set the stage for why we need a financial mechanism to help make these commitments and these the things that Frank and Jeff talked about. How do we really facilitate change? How do we really meet the goals that the industry, the livestock industry, has set? And so I want to start out with a few statistics. 81% of consumers want and care about where their products and where their food comes from. They want it to have a more positive impact on the environment. It's something many of us care very much about. And in response to that, companies have set very aggressive goals on changing the way their products are produced to ensure that they have a fewer or a less impact on the environment. So as of last week when I looked at this, there were about 4,800 companies who have set science-based targets on how to reduce their emissions. That represents 38 trillion of the global economy. That's 1/3 of the global economy. And of that, a huge number of those companies represent the companies that are responsible for bringing the food to the table of these consumers. So when these companies set these commitments and they were trying to respond to the needs of their consumers, many of them did not realize or didn't quite understand that when they set these goals, that the majority of the emissions associated with the products that they produce were actually associated with the work that's done at the farm gate. It's actually the emissions associated on the farms. And so these companies now have these very aggressive goals that they need to meet, but they have few ways to incentivize producers to engage in the activities that they need to get done in order to reach those goals. So when you think about this from the perspective of the producer, there was a recent survey by Trust in Food that said 93% of farmers are aware that there are markets, there are carbon markets that exist that they could participate in, but there's only a 3% participation among the farming community in those markets. And why is that? The reason is because in a traditional offset market, the amount of work that has to go into participating from a farmer's perspective is enormous. There's an enormous amount of paperwork that's involved in this. There is an enormous amount of time delay from I've installed this particular thing, it's going to reduce my emissions, but it's going to be years before I see any financial impact to my farm within these markets that help to offset that cost. So from a producer's perspective, they're very hesitant to engage in these things because it's going to take a very long time for them to see a return on investment. It's very confusing, it's very complex, they don't know who to trust, and they don't know who to talk to get advice around this. So there's a significant amount of barriers to entry for them to be able to engage. So that's why Athian exists. Athian is here to help the livestock industry to meet their goals, and not just from the perspective of the farmer, but from the perspective of those companies that are responsible for producing the products that end up on your table. And what we're really trying to facilitate here is the ability for the livestock industry specifically to meet their goals. So how does a large company, a consumer packaged goods company, reach those goals whenever they need to be able to impact farmers specifically in reaching those goals? If you think about it, just in the US alone, there's over 700,000 farmers associated with the livestock industry. How do those companies impact that many producers, that many farmers at scale? Because we need all of those farmers to be part of the solution. We need all of those farmers to be able to participate. And if you look at it from the farmer's perspective, we need to be able to have an ecosystem that actually democratizes the access to these types of markets. So when we look at building a solution, so Athian is a software company, Athian builds a tool that allows for farmers to be able to engage in this type of marketplace and to be able to deliver a credible, quantified asset to the end of the value chain, talking about the big companies that are putting the food on the table, that allows them to actually reach their goals. We have to simplify this process. We have to use data and leverage software to scale it out to as many producers as we possibly can, to scale it to as many companies as we possibly can. So when you look at what it is that Athian actually does, we take what can be very complex, complicated intervention methodologies, these protocols, or these mitigation activities that farmers can engage in. We turn that into a very simple recipe, step 1, step 2, step 3. This is what you need to do to ensure that you're meeting the requirements of a particular mitigation activity. We also have to make sure that producers have the opportunity to understand what is the impact to my operations by engaging in this particular activity. So giving producers access to all the things that they could do, understanding the financial and the operational impacts of that, empowers them to make informed decisions, puts the choice back in the hands of the farmers so that they can be part of the solution and not being handed down mandates or dictates on what they need to do. Once a farmer is engaged in these activities, they've decided to implement a particular intervention, we bring in third parties to verify that those producers actually followed that recipe, to come in and verify that the results or the outcomes that were measured are accurate. And then once those things are verified by independent third parties, we can then transfer those claims or those positive outcomes to those large companies that have made those very aggressive commitments and fund the cost of that back to the producers. And one of the things that's very different about the way that the Athian platform works is instead of it taking years for a producer to see some sort of return on investment, we actually operate on a 30-day cycle. So once producers implement an activity, we capture data using their on-farm systems. We automate much of the verification process. So think about this from the perspective of pulling the data that actually comes from their operations. It's a great, credible primary source for the measurement of the outcomes. Then we're able to send that data to a verifier, have them do their work. Within 30 days, that asset or that claim is certified and minted as a credible mitigation activity, and then we can sell it to the end of the value chain and then funnel that money directly back to the producer. That's really the thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about today, making sure that the most important thing that we have to think about, not just from a climate change perspective, is how do we incentivize and provide an opportunity for producers to engage in these types of activities? Because the producers, the farmers, are really the solution here in solving this problem for all of us. Thank you.
So I think you see that there really is a significant issue here that needs to be addressed to involve and feed the world, but that there are some very good things in a toolbox and that those are being worked on, and that there's a mechanism to allow this to come in by the carrot, not the stick, in terms of getting that kind of cooperation from the people that are out there doing this. I think it would be helpful. I know for me it was helpful to know about a couple of the specific things in the toolbox, and wonder if either Frank or Jeff would be willing to talk about something called 3-NOP that might be one of the big things that could help. Ooh.
Yeah, so there are numerous feed additives, things that you can add to a cow's ration that either change the microbes that exist in the digestive system, or that inhibit methane. That methane production is an enzymatic production. Those various feed additives can reduce 10 to 30, maybe even 40% of enteric methane, and that's a big deal. This particular additive you're referring to, 3-NOP or Bovaer, is a methane inhibitor. So it disrupts the enzymatic formation of methane. If you feed a little bit, you reduce a little methane. If you feed more, you reduce more. And there are over 50 peer-reviewed papers now on this particular additive. It is already in use in much of the world. It will be in use in the United States soon, and it gives many people hope.
Okay. And I assume this is one of those things that will be pretty easily verified for your system, is that right?
Yeah, so 3-NOP as a mitigation activity within the Athian platform, the things that we will measure to ensure that we've got good, credible, science-backed claims for the person or the company that is financially incentivizing a producer to do this. We have to look at things like, was the feed additive fed? I mean, the basic. Can you evidence the number of cows that were on a particular farm? Having a third party come in and measure and understand the actual activities that are happening on a particular farm is one of the things that we can do within our platform in a much more automated way, and being able to support the quantified outcomes from the use of that feed additive provides a level of transparency, auditability, and frankly, defensibility for those in the value chain that want to be able to take credit for those activities.
So I assume that gets you away from some of the sort of greenwashing sort of things that have happened with some of the claims of carbon offsets, right?
Yeah, so if you think about the difference between what we're doing and what's happening in an offset market, in an offset market, this is where there is I'll use the word, a polluter who is doing something detrimental to the environment. They then invest funds in, I'm going to use the Amazon as the example, in a landowner in the Amazon to keep the trees intact, to make sure they're not cut down, right? This is a relationship between two entities that have no industry knowledge of each other. They have no trust relationship at all. And what's happening here has to be verified, or there's a lot of intermediaries who are part of the process for those trees being verified as not being cut down, or the actual impacts of that. And this company is actually paying to pollute, essentially. But what that does, those two transactions, they offset each other, literally offset, and they balance each other out. What's happening in the livestock industry, and what Athian is doing specifically, is taking the work that's done between a particular supply chain and being able to allow each of those players that are already basically known to each other to be able to collaboratively work on solving the problem together and provide a financial incentive back to the farmer directly within their supply chain. So if you think about the difference between an offset where you're paying somebody somewhere else to do something to offset something that you're doing that's not that good for the environment, what we're talking about is allowing companies to come directly within their supply chain and address the actual emissions associated with the production of their particular product. It is a much more powerful and systemic way for them to reduce emissions, and it is a much more impactful way to have a longer term impact on the way emissions are generated.
Yeah, I might build, Steve, on your greenwashing comment. I think it's really important to keep a very high bar here. Sustainable means a lot of things have to be sustainable. So a few principles that I know a lot of the industry is working against is, one, the farmer has to make, a return. And even if there's not a economic gain by a product like 3NOP or others, this inset market makes it sustainable within itself. We're not dependent upon government incentives. We're not dependent upon other industries offsetting. They may be needed to kickstart, but they shouldn't be what the model is built on. So this inset market is really powerful. Farmer profitability is powerful. There's been a lot of solutions that have come in animals that has never been actually implemented because there wasn't profitability. A farm needs to be profitable to adapt. So I think that's key. I think the other side for us as an innovator is we want to be regulated. We want the bar to be high. We need third-party verification ourselves. This product 3NOP will be an FDA product that will go through a review process that looks at animal safety, environmental safety, human safety. I think you need to have a bar very high on innovation, or innovators will take advantage of that. We don't want that. I think also the independent verification, to be able to say farms need to have data, analytics, and that bar needs to be high so that there's farm verification, so that it's SCS Global or whatever, there's a third-party verification system. So an inset market, farmer profitability, regulated by the innovation, and independent SCS Global, that to me makes something that is very sustainable, it's credible, and it's something that will be, a solution for the long term. We cannot do something here immediate in the short term. And that's why Elanco, we have one of the first FDA environmentally approved feed additive products in beef today. It took us many extra years, many extra dollars, but we felt like, hey, this is the future, and we're investing. There's already 45 countries that have approved 3NOP. The United States is not. There's a pretty high bar, and we support that high bar because we believe when it's here, the American consumer can trust that it is right and it is a product that's sustainable, as well as the American farmer.
Now, the one voice that really wouldn't be possible to have on the panel here today would be a cow, and we would need an interpreter. But is there just, because this is not a real familiar thing for most of us, is there any benefit to the cow from this whole business of having methane burping out, or is reducing that something that a cow would appreciate at some level? I mean,
well, there's a reason why she burps. So when she digests things such as cellulose, hydrogen is built up, and this hydrogen needs to come out, and it does come out by CO2 binding to hydrogen and forming methane, CH4. That methane is removed through belching. The issue, however, is we don't have to have belching to the extent that it currently happens. I mean, some belching is important. Let's say 30–40% of what a cow belches, actually she should belch because she needs to get rid of the hydrogen. But the rest is really a net loss of energy. Just think about it. 10% approximately of the energy that you feed to a cow gets lost as methane. Methane is nothing other than energy. And that energy gets lost. So it's a loss not just to the environment, it's a loss also to the pocketbook of the producer. We do not want to just put methane into the atmosphere because then it becomes a liability. We want to manage methane by either reducing it or, in the case of manure management, cap it, convert it into fuels and put it into semi-trucks, not waste it. We want to turn a liability into an asset. And that is not greenwashing, that's real. And our farmers can be a very important part of that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that sort of demonstrates that a solution can really get implemented if there's an economic driver behind it. And that the other way that methane happens because of cows is that cows generate manure, not a big surprise, but if the manure is stored in a way that there isn't oxygen available, then there are some of these same microbes called methanogens that will turn it into methane. And that solution is in many areas actually being widely implemented because you can build this facility called a methane digester and turn that into energy. And maybe somebody could describe why some of the programs that have actually helped encourage a lot of adoption, because these are real expensive things to build, but they are happening. And why is that they are actually happening?
Well, I mean, I can speak to that because we are doing a lot of this in California. California has the most ambitious methane reduction laws in the country. 40%, 40, of methane needs to be reduced by the year 2030. And the first and foremost tool there has been by law reductions through manure management. And here, the capturing or capping of lagoons from where normally biogas goes into the air, that capping now caps the biogas and with it the methane. It's then being cleaned up and made into transportation fuels. This one technology alone has helped our dairy farmers in California to achieve 1/3 of its methane goal already, which is a reduction of 2.5 million metric tons of CO2e. 7.2 is the total goal. They have already achieved 2.5. And once we have feed additives and other technologies come online, our farmers will achieve and indeed overachieve the 40% reduction. And once they do, then what I showed you on this slide, the strong reduction of warming, can become a reality. And our farmers will be a very important part of achieving the states and eventually the United States climate goals, methane goals.
Yeah. And I think the economic sustainability is there's economic value in that gas and that energy that's being redirected. I think as you look at what we're looking at in an inset market is a producer is going to actually reduce a consumer product good company in dairy connected to that farm for a very small percent, 1-2% of their cost is now got a very environmentally friendly product. The number one challenge for most major dairy beef companies is what this next generation is thinking and to create a much more environmentally sustainable brand. Yeah. And if you offer that value proposition in the boardrooms all over the world, I was in Europe last week with a few, for that small nominal cost, you get this much more brand value. And it's sustainable and it's real, and it's in an inset market, not in the Amazons and an offset. That is valuable. And that's how this becomes a couple pennies per gallon, and what that does to the dollars per cow over the course of the year is the second area of value. So I've seen a lot of innovations come to the animal industry that never get adopted because they're not economically sustainable. Mm-hmm. We can't innovate them because farmers, this is a cash business. And it's real. So these are two, I would say, pockets of economic value that are critical.
And the other thing I would just add to that, that's a great point. This is exactly the point that I was going to make about the difference between this being part of an offset opportunity and an inset opportunity, and the difference that makes from the producer's perspective, but the industry as a whole is incredibly important to focus on. But the other thing is, how do we, in California, California has been a leader in putting incentives in place to get producers to change their practices to reduce their emissions. That is not necessarily true for the other states in the United States. So how do we provide an opportunity for other producers and other locales to be able to participate in this type of opportunity and tie it directly back to the livestock industry. So how do we get more farms with the opportunity to install a digester, to do a cap over their manure, or any other manure management practice that reduces the amount of emissions, along with the feed additives or the burping methane that we can reduce. It's critically important that we be able to scale this out to as many producers as we possibly can.
They're receiving two checks. The American farmer needs to receive two checks for their protein and for their environmental footprint reduction, their carbon check. And when that happens, this thing changes in a big way. Let me assure you, the cattle. And then the people that say, well, you know, cattle removal, hang on. The second thing, Frank said something very powerful. Over 80% of the global cattle, the land that they graze on globally, we can't use that. So if you take animals away, they're meant for a reason to be. They're part of the system, the ecosystem. They actually consume things that nobody can consume, and there'll be waste, and you'll have another environmental problem, and they turn it into protein, a very powerful food product. So we cannot remove animals, or the ecosystem doesn't work. And that's another point that I don't think it's communicated. And listen, farmers are humble people that are environmentalists, that are innovators, but they put their head down. They come from generations of just do your job. And probably our biggest problem is we're not advocating that the cow can be part of the solution. That's the sad thing. I come from 3 generations in the dairy industry, and the job is just put your head down and produce a good product. And so we need to communicate for the American farmer as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, this system is something that sounds, very doable, very positive, particularly within a system like we have in the United States. But that's based on some real advances that have happened over past decades in terms of the general genetics and productivity per animal and feed efficiency and all that sort of thing. But it hasn't happened as much in the beef cattle industry because it isn't as sort of organized, and you don't have a place to collect all the manure. In fact, the manure is out there fertilizing those grasslands. But how much of this is going to be possible in that beef sector?
Yep, Frank, maybe you can build on this, but listen, out of all the species, if you look at fish and poultry and pigs, they're pretty concentrated, and that's, from an environmental standpoint, that's good. Dairy, the same thing, especially U.S. dairy. When you start looking at a beef industry where, there's calves and cow-calf and 20, 30, cow operations. We were talking about your family, in North Carolina or Tennessee, and it ends up in a feed yard. That chain, that value chain is a lot more complex. Mm-hmm. And so I do think, Steve, it's going to take some time, but listen, there's a lot of innovation there because there's a lot of emissions there, I think, when you look at the footprint. So if we can create this value chain in a dairy, the innovations will come, whether that's something that's got longer duration or new ways of administering to cows that are on grass. That's a challenge. There's innovators in New Zealand right now because their dairy industry is on grass, not in barns. So I think innovation will come, but it will come a little slower, but that's our next challenge.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. Now, how do you imagine that these sort of advances and the progress that's being made on this, how will that present to the consumer? Do you think this is something we'll start seeing in the store in brands, and how do you communicate that? Because sometimes the messaging we see at the consumer level isn't particularly helpful.
I'll take a first stab at that. So one of the things that is, consumers care very much about where their products come from, and companies care very much about responding to the needs of their consumers and the wants of their consumers. But one of the things that we lack at the moment is the ability to provide those companies the ability to say, I directly impacted what happened at the farm level for the products that I produce, because we don't have a good mechanism to trace this farmer did this thing and that product followed its way all the way to the retail shelves. one of the things that creating a marketplace like this or creating an opportunity like this or solving this specifically for climate change allows there to be a much more defensible, credible marketing around the things that companies are able to legitimately say that's happening within their direct supply chain. They are providing direct financial incentive to producers, to farmers that are directly within their supply chain. And that's a fabulous story for them to be able to tell. From a consumer's perspective, there's a lot more trust in that if those companies can show the receipts, right? Show the trail, show the documentation that supports the claim that they're making. There's not a mechanism or not a reliable mechanism that allows for that to happen, or maybe a better way, there's not a scalable mechanism to allow that to happen. And so that's one of the things, creating an ecosystem that supports this will allow those companies to be able to do, and then provide much more trust back to consumers on the branding or the packaging or the claims that these companies are making.
That's great. Now, we have just a little bit more time here, and I'm going to open this up to some questions from the floor. And then if we don't have time to get to all of those, the speakers will be outside in the lobby between this and the next session, and you can talk to them in person. So if I could take a couple of questions, that would be great. Yes?
Thank you so much. Question, where does the money that Athian is going to distribute come from? Do the cows like this NLP, and what percentage of cows actually are grain-fed as opposed to being on the grass? And if you do capture this this methane and use it for fuel, won't it turn into CO2?
The Athian question, I answer very quickly. The funding for this comes from the different stakeholders within a particular supply chain. So if I use an example, a company that's made a claims like Nestle, companies like Costco, companies like Walmart, those are the ones that are providing the financial incentive.
Maybe to your last point, where's that carbon going? So first of all, the carbon that goes into methane originates in CO2, goes through photosynthesis in the feed plants. The animals then produce methane. That methane is broken down into CO2 again, but this CO2 is not new and additional. It was CO2 before. So that's called a biogenic carbon cycle.
It's not fossil CO2.
Yeah, and it's not additional CO2 that's resulting.
Okay, yeah, please.
So what kept striking me during your conversation is what percentage of farming is small compared to the big industrial groups? And at what point in the near future do you think like your company and these efforts can apply? At what level? How large does a farm need to be? Head of cattle and stuff.
Great question. I would say I was in the U.S. Department of Agriculture last week, and the statistic was shared. We've lost 140,000 farms in America the last 5 years. And I believe that what we've just talked about is a way to create more sustainability of the American farm. So to me, I think everything we've talked about is not size dependent. If it's a 200 cow dairy or 2,000 cow, this is a feed additive that could be used in feed, can be mixed in a ration normally, and an analytics package is really integrated into the data. Most every dairy farm has it's table stakes to be in business to have a data system, so it's integrating into that. So there's no capital big expense, maybe even like a biodigester on the stuff we've talked about. It's a great question. Doesn't get asked enough.
Right. Okay, great.
Just thanks to the panelists. This was just an absolutely fascinating presentation. Obviously, if you want to make a big impact, you're going to have to go after the big guys, the feedlots, the 1,000 bazillion cow operations. I have 40 cows. What can I do tomorrow?
Yeah. First thing I would say, probably what you're doing is that analytics and data matter. I had dinner last night with a dairyman that says, I spent a lot of time looking at that data. The first hour of my day is the data. I think making sure that, it's the protocols and the interventions that we're going to bring, and maybe things you're already doing that you can get value from. Being able to know those protocols and that analytics package is number one. I think it's going to start on the computer linking to what's going on the farm. Then when an intervention comes, you're going to be able to get value. That would be the very first thing. And I think, listen, just like all of us, mastery comes with, I don't think it takes 10,000 hours, as Daniel Pink says, but I think it takes 4 or 5 hours a week to really start studying this. We all need to become experts in this.
What's really important is this. Whether you are small or large, we all have to do our job, okay? Small or large. Many of these technologies are scalable. They work for a 50-head farm and they work for a 5,000-head farm. Some of the technologies are not scalable, like anaerobic digesters. They cost multi-million dollars. But everybody can do something, and the toolbox is broader than what we discussed today. It also includes things such as genetics, improved genetics. It includes, in the future, it might include vaccination. There are different tools that will be in your toolbox, and you will have to decide which tools to choose. What's important is that it's a voluntary and incentive-based approach. That works is something I can attest to because I see it day in, day out in the state where I live.
Thank you.
Great.
I agree. It was a really great presentation. I learned a lot. I live in Wisconsin, so I have kind of a vested interest in this topic as well. Yes. I grew up in Wyoming, so I mean, this is big for me. And I really appreciated the comment about the smaller farms because that is a concern, especially in Wisconsin right now with a lot of those loss of farms are really centered in Wisconsin. The one word I didn't hear in this presentation is the word organic. And I was wondering, you talked about sustainable, you talked about claims, being able to trace the source. That's where the organic actually wins because it can claim back to the source of how that thing was produced. What does your trends do for the organic claims in the dairy industry?
So the organic farms might have a steeper hill to climb because many of the technologies that will be out there will not be allowed under organic protocols. And so rather than using certain additives or so, they might go a route of breeding for low methane cows, for example, which is possible. There are now assays for it. So you have to look at what are the approaches that are effective on the one side, but also allowed under organic standards on the other side. And that's where some of the organic farmers have been held back in the past. I hope that the organic standards will evolve and adjust because they should around animal health, around productivity and so on, because that's where some of the greatest gains can be made.
Okay, my quick question for Jeff. I'm pretty interested in the new technologies and things that you are seeing. I come from a country that has more cows than people in Brazil, so ruminants are really important there. So what do you see here that would change? And the numbers you show here are really important in terms of volume of emissions and stuff. How do you see in the next years? What kind of technologies and how much of that number we could diminish, work on in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yes, great question. And I think country you come from, the country I lived in, and is a good example. And but I think we can markedly move the needle quickly, I believe. I mean, there's already been a lot of stuff with that we've moved, but I'll just use the 3-NOP. It's 30% in dairy, 50% in beef, reduction in enteric methane. That's more than the industry maybe has done in 20 years if you just look at so I believe there's innovations coming there. I also believe the analytics package, and when you look at something economically sustainable, that makes farmers start to say, we're going to measure what matters because there's economic gain to do that. That's going to accelerate. And then look, industries like ours, farm animal innovation has been limited. There's vaccines and others. So there's an innovation revolution going on too. These are all things that I think say the next decade, this will be a couple $2 billion industry, I believe. And that's what makes things move quickly. We see that with AI or electric vehicles, and I think that this is the next big opening of opportunity, not in just the US, I think countries like Brazil as well.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate you all coming today, and like I say, the speakers will be outside the room here for the break for the next half hour. And so thank you guys again for all your good information today.
Thank you.